Okay, so we're in the middle of discussing the Gemara on Daf. Here, you can see me, right? And here. If you can't hear or see, just let me know.
Do and hear you.
So we're discussing the Gemara here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph that we began last time. So again, we're talking about the principle of Tzaras Erva. So let's just circle back a little bit just to get the background again that we need. Okay. So the Mishnah says that the mitzvah of Yibum, which typically applies in a situation where you have a brother who died and he left no children, right? And he was married. We're going to take the case where he has more than one wife, which is a pre-Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom, because that's to explain the principle of Tzaras Erva. We need that. So basically, we had Reuven, who was married and had two wives. One wife was the daughter of Shimon, his brother. We'll call her Shimona, just so we can keep track of her. He's allowed to marry his niece, as we've discussed. And the other wife of Reuven, we'll call her Sarah. Sarah is a tzara. Sarah with a sin is a tzara with a tzadi, meaning she is a co-wife or a rival to the first wife. So Reuven has two wives, the daughter of Shimon, his niece, and another woman. And what the Mishnah tells us is that if that is the circumstance, Shimon cannot be miyabim either his daughter, because that's an erba, but the bigger chiddush is that he can't be miyabim his daughter's co-wife or rival wife with Reuven either. I can now see Rabbi Roth. Good to see
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
So
and I've seen you all along.
Oh, okay. See, you have an advantage, but that's okay. Either way, it's a pleasure. You're Baruch Hashem. You're looking well.
Thank you.
So that the principle is, and this is a chiddush, and it's ad kidei kach a chiddush that Beis Shammai in the Mishnah on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph disagrees. According to Beis Shammai, if there are two wives, one of whom is also an erva, a daughter, a mother-in-law, a sister of one's wife, and so on, any of the 15 that are enumerated in the Mishnah. So Beis Shammai takes a very reasonable position, and that is that woman is excluded from Yibum. She doesn't need chalitza, and she's excluded from Yibum. But why should that disqualify the second wife, or the third wife, or the fourth wife? Let's say there are four wives. Reuven had four wives, let's say. Or, it's like King, like Henry VIII, he had six wives. So why are all the other wives excluded just because one of them is an erva? So Beis Shammai says it's not true. And that's what the Mishnah records on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, that there was this, very essential debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with very, practical consequences, but that nonetheless, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were very civil to each other and very respectful of each other. Again, they were very principled about their own view. So if anybody was, in this situation where there was a consequence to their argument, then, they were principled and consistent with their own positions. However, says the Mishnah, when it came to other, questions of intermarriage, of marrying within each other's camps, they were very open to that as long as there was no actual debate. Anyway, so Beis Shammai takes...
The fundamental difference between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is whether the wives are independent entities or they have some relationship to each other which binds them to each other, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it could be that what binds them to each other is precisely the Zika. So we'll get back to that. But so Beis Shammai's view, though, like if you had to pick which is the more default, which is the more obvious view, and it's important to sometimes try to do that so then you can more fully appreciate, the significance of the normative view, which in this case is Beis Hillel. So I would say without hesitation that the default, more understandable view is Beis Shammai in this case. but we paskin like Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel came up with this chiddush, and that is that if one of the team, or one of the group, one of the candidate pool of the wives is an erva, so that disqualifies all of them. And the question is how to explain it. So what we were discussing last week was this following discussion in the Gemara. The Gemara says on Dav Gimel Amud Aleph that the Gemara asked the question, my area, this is almost in the middle of the page, a little bit more than 50% down. The Gemara says, in my area, Datani Potros, Lisni Osros. The Mishnah says that there are 15 ervas, and it says that are potros, that exempt the tsaros as well. And then it goes on and lists them, and we talked about that. Why does it say exempt? Why doesn't it say prohibits? And as Rashi explains, what's the benefit of saying prohibits? Because if I say exempts, it sounds like there's a choice. It sounds like, okay, if if they don't want to do yibum, then it's fine. But potros exempt doesn't necessarily mean that it's forbidden. So it's not accurate. One would have thought that maybe it isn't fully accurate to say potros, and you should have said osros, because once is a tsaras erva, once is a co-wife to one of these ervas, there's no permissibility. It's prohibited to do yibum. So that's what the Gemara. Potros, lisni osros. I'm sorry, what?
Ask a factual clarification.
Yeah.
If Shimon's daughter is one of the X number of wives that Reuven had, for example, and if she dies, do the remaining wives still have that same problem?
Which problem?
That they're a tzara to the erva. In other words, if Shimon's wife, the one that was the erva, dies, okay?
I mean Reuven's wife.
Reuven's wife dies.
Oh, so that's what the Mishnah says. If Reuven's erva wife, meaning the daughter of Shimon, if she died before Reuven died, then there would be no problem.
And if she died and afterwards, even though she's dead, there still would be a problem.
Yes, everything depends on the moment of the first of the brother's death. That's what the words mean.
And the status of a wife that is married, well, it can't happen. Okay.
No, so that's what these words mean in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says on Beis Amud Beis that vikulan imesu o mianu o nisgarshu o shenimtsu ilanis tsarosean mutaros. That's what those words mean.
I just need
but everything depends on the moment of what we call the nefila, or the zika, the beginning of the zika, meaning the moment of the husband's death. There's a debate later on in the Gemara whether or not nisuin mapilos, in which case the critical moment might even be earlier. It's certainly at the moment of the death, but maybe even at the moment of the first marriage. But let's leave that aside for now. Okay, so the Gemara says that, why do we use this expression? So the Gemara says, Itani Osros havamina osli yadim aval michlat skolza. I'm on the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph, Kamashman. So the Gemara says, well, if we use the expression osur, we might have thought that means that there can't be yibum, but maybe there can be chalitza. So the Gemara says, velisni asura lachlots. So the Gemara says, why don't you just say that there's a prohibition to do chalitza? Be explicit about it. You don't need to say potros yibum v'chalitza. So the Gemara mo my ka'avid alam alo, right? So imata omer choletza. So the Gemara says misyaveh. Meaning the Gemara says there's no prohibition to do chalitza. You're just not obligated to do chalitza. So what's the problem? So the Gemara says, well, if you make a statement that there is, that it's osros, and the implication would be that there is chalitza, then people will think that there's some yibum as well, b'diavad, because chalitza and yibum, as we'll discuss, go hand in hand. Okay, so finally, the Gemara's answer to this question, haven't answered it yet. They keep, neutralizing the answers. The question is, why does the Mishnah use the expression exempt instead of forbid? So the Gemara has a very, compact, but I believe highly conceptual answer. And the Gemara says as follows: Kiven dibamakom mitzvah huda asira tzara kama v'shalo b'makom mitzvah shari mishum hachi tani potros. So Rashi interprets this line the following way. This principle of tsaras erva, the way Rashi understands it, can be, in theory, explained in two different ways. One way to explain it is that it's a misnomer, meaning the words tsaras erva, ke'erva, are not really true. Really what they are describing in shorthand is a process, but it's not really a good legal description of what's happening. So let me explain. What's really happening, according to this perspective, is the following. Yeah. When there's an erva, that's exactly what you just said a second ago. When there's an erva in the mix, the problem is there's no zika. Because what Beis Hillel was assuming and Beis Shammai disagreeing about is Beis Hillel is assuming that when it comes to zika, according to this perspective, it's all or nothing. Meaning the zika applies uniformly to the group of wives as a unit. And therefore, if there's one in the mix that is excluded, that is disqualified, then the zika is not chala, doesn't apply to any of them. Now, what happens if there's no zika? So then every one of these women is what we call an eishasach shelo b'makom mitzvah. Meaning she's a regular sister-in-law, wife of a brother, as if there wasn't a case of yibum, because there's no zika liyibum. So why is a tsaras erva prohibited from yibum and doesn't require chalitza either? Says Rashi, the answer is not because the tsaras erva assumes the status of the erva. So, for example, let's say Shimona, right, the daughter of Shimon, she's the erva. She's a daughter. Does she pass on the virtual status of, ervas habas to Sarah, the tzara, to the other wife? The other wife is prohibited because she's a tsaras bas? The answer is no, not really. What happens is there's a bas, there's a daughter. Since there's a daughter, that disrupts the zika. Since you disrupt the zika, there's everybody, the daughter in addition, and everybody else, including Sarah, turn into an eishasach shelo b'makom mitzvahs ibum, and that is prohibited. That's how Rashi interprets. However, says Rashi, that what the Gemara means to say is that's all well and good, and that's what we just signified by the word potros. Potros means mimela, meaning it's not that tsaras erva is excluded per se, it's that if you have an erva, so it unravels the whole zika, and when there's no zika, so mimela, by default,
everything goes back to the first position.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to see the problem with that in just a minute, but that is how Rashi says, if that's true, you can understand why the din of tsaras erva only applies in the context of yibum. So, for example, let's consider the following scenario. Not yibum, not a brother. Let's say let's say a person's daughter, let's say you have a man named Bob, okay? And he has a daughter, Roberta, okay? So his daughter, Bob marries off his daughter to his son-in-law, who the man who becomes his son-in-law. His name is Bill. So Bill is now married to Roberta, the daughter of Bob, right? Now, Bill has a second wife also, right? Let's say Dinah. So he has two wives, Dinah and Roberta. Now, let's say Bill, the son-in-law of Bob, dies. Can Bob, his former father-in-law, marry Dinah? He certainly can't marry Roberta. That's his daughter. There's no yibum here. We're just talking about a regular shidduch, right? A man marries off his daughter to his son-in-law. The son-in-law has another wife. The son-in-law dies. Can the father-in-law marry the other wife of his son-in-law? Everybody with me?
Yeah.
So lahalacha, the answer is yes. There's no din of tsaras erva. That would be called, if that was prohibited, that would be called tsaras erva shelo b'makom yibum, meaning outside the confines of yibum, right? The idea of a co-wife or a rival wife, which has impact in terms of halachic legal status, doesn't exist. So what Rashi said, that's what these words mean in the Gemara. I'm going to go back to the Gemara now. It's a very compact conceptual line. The Gemara says, listen, the reason we use the expression potros and not osros is kiven de b'makom mitzvahu dasira tzara, since the only time that a tzara, right, a co-wife to an erva is excluded is in the context of makom mitzvah. Makom mitzvah means in the context of the mitzvah of yibum, namely a brother died, left no child. Now there's a mitzvah of yibum, but you encounter a situation where one of the candidates is an erva, the other candidate, is not per se, but she becomes a tsaras erva.
Aren't they both eshesach?
I'm sorry?
Aren't they both eshesach?
Well, but eshesach in the context of yibum isn't a problem. So the way Rashi's
But
interpreting
eshesach, not in the context of yibum, is definitely a problem.
Right.
Whether it's one wife, two wives, or three wives, they all have the definition of eshesach.
Right. That's how Rashi understands the problem of tsaras erva.
How can you possibly understand it any other way?
Oh, I'll explain in a second. Just 1 second. So if that's the case, then that's the next line. Kimin de b'makom mitzvah hu dasira tzara. And according to Rashi, I'm going to read the Rashi inside in 1 second. So Rashi says, because of what you just said, because it reduces to eshesach since there's no mitzvah. But then you have to say in the next line, the shelo b'makom mitzvah, shari. What does that mean? That means if it wasn't in the context of the mitzvah of yibum, but we were simply talking about a tsaras erva of another relationship, let's say my son-in-law's other wife, and my son-in-law dies, can I marry his other wife? That kind of tsaras erva. That's called shelo b'makom mitzvah. That is shari. That's mutter. You could do that. So mishum haki tani potros. Now look at Rashi, and you'll see what Rashi explains. So what would be before we get to that, what would be the rationale of thinking, even the havamina, of thinking that if my son-in-law has a second wife, I can't marry her after he dies? What would be the basis of saying tsaras erva shelo b'makom mitzvah? So the answer is, it's not because of
Yibum.
No,
right?
it has nothing to do with yibum. There's no yibum here.
No, I'm saying by Yibum that Sarah Patra is the other person.
By yibum, you can have everything turn into eshesach. So that's very convenient. What would if it had been the other way? What would it be based on? The answer is it would be based on erva by association. In other words, if even if you're not my daughter or my mother-in-law or my wife's sister, the fact that you are a co-wife, right, who shared a family, a husband with my daughter or with my wife's sister or with my mother-in-law, that connection, that association is still enough of a stigma, right, to exclude marriage. That's what it would have been, but we don't paskin that way. Okay, now that's based on what principle? Not the idea that somehow everything turns into eshesach, because it doesn't. There's no eshesach when we're talking about a regular son-in-law and so on. What is the idea? The idea that erva is not only usher in its own right, but the association with erva, right, is also a kind of a stigma. It's a violation of tznius, you could call it. I mean, there's a logic to this, even though it's very mechudash, and that is, somebody who, had this kind of an intimate bond with an erva, right? That it's still too close for comfort from, a kedusha relationship point of view. It's still too close for comfort, and that would have been tsaras erva. But since that is not true, says Rashi. Now look at the Rashi; you'll see exactly what I just said. So look at Rashi Dibramasel Kiva de Malkom Mitzvah Yibum Huda Asira. So Rashi says, Tsaras Habas. We're talking about the co-wife of a daughter, meaning Ruvain who died, had married his niece, Shimon's daughter. I'm calling her Shimona. He had another wife called Sarah. Kidemifarish b'masnisin. Demisha patra kasuv mizika sibum. Once there is no Zika because of the presence of Shimona, of the daughter of Shimon, so that breaks up the Zika. Listen to the language. So then Sarah, the Tzara, by virtue of the fact that Shimona messes up or breaks up the Zika, everybody turns into an Eshasach Shelo b'makom mitzvah who is prohibited. That's Rashi. But Shelo b'makom mitzvah shari. What is that? Kigo Nochri. Nochri here means a non-relative. Meaning what I said before. Bob married his daughter, Roberta, off to Bill. Bill has a second wife, Dinah. So it's also, is she a Tsaras Erva? After all, Dinah is a co-wife with Bob's daughter. That's Tsaras Erva. But it's Shelo b'makom yibum because it's not, this is not a yibum situation. It's a stamba marriage. So that's what Rashi explains. Kago nochri shenasa chasno, a non-relative, not his brother, but a stranger, becomes his son-in-law. Velo isha cheres, and he, in addition to marrying this fellow's daughter, has another wife, umeis, and then he, the son-in-law, dies. Muteris ishto lechamiv. The other wife is a permissible partner to the father-in-law. So Rashi then explains, this is kind of brilliant. Rashi said, what does this have to do with potros and osros? So Rashi says the following. Mishum hachi rather tana potros. That's why the Mishnah used the language of exemption rather than prohibition, because the itana osros, if we had used the language of prohibition, mashma shahabas osrasa alav likach, then the implication would be that the presence of the daughter in the mix is what defines the tzara, the co-wife, as an erba. And if that were true, then that would apply not only in the context of yibum, but any time. Because what we're basically saying is that tzaras erba harehi ke'erba, that this association is also enough to poison the relationship. But then we would use the expression osros because it's the fault of the daughter passes on her status, or the sister-in-law or the mother-in-law or whatever passes on the status virtually to the other candidate and therefore disqualifies them. However, that's not really what's happening, says Rashi, because if that's really what was happening, then it would apply even shelo b'makom yibum. It would apply even in a son-in-law case, right? Then it would be kal v'chomer shelo b'makom mitzvah. Aval potros, but the word potros lo mishtamea isura mishum tzarasa shabas. But the word exempt doesn't imply that the status of ervas bas is virtually applied or passed on to the co-wife. Doesn't imply that. Ela habas potrosa miyibum. What it really means is that the fact that in the mix there is a daughter, exempts everybody from yibum. And once there's no yibum, then isura shochiv ala mimela, that's a key word in Rashi, then just by automatically everybody reverts to being what they would have been if there was no mitzvah to begin with, because now there's no mitzvah, and that is eshes ach shelo b'makom mitzvah. The hava be'iser eshes ach sheyesh labanim umishum eshes ach hu demitzar shelo b'makom mitzvah. The leika iser eshes ach Allah shari.
Let me try to see if I can understand this without linguistic complications.
Okay.
I mean, look at it for a second. All 15 of the ervas.
Yeah.
The situation basically is that all of them, you cannot marry them. They're all off base. The big revelation is that you could marry the Eshesach, okay, under certain circumstance of Yibum.
Correct.
And normally the co-wives of anybody else, everybody would say, fine, logic, there's nothing wrong. Okay, fine. The problem, as becomes, I think, clear, is that once you allow the Eishes Ach, the Mokum Yibum, to have that potential intimate relationship, it poisons everybody else in the group. Okay, and because once you have that potential for intimate relationship, okay, you've now made the rest of the wives somehow, for whatever reason, the Torah seems to have that look in that approach in certain other things. You've now made them something closer to intimacy, which the Torah frowns upon at the general concept of certain intimacies, and therefore that's why that stands out. But everybody would agree, number one, that all 15 are usher to you. Number two, all 15's wives, other wives are paturas to you. There's no problem. Right. All right. In comes the great revelation, which is Yibum. Okay. Yibum says, oops, you know what? You can have this relationship, which is totally off the books. Okay. You can have it in the makom when your brother has no children, etc., etc. Okay. Right. Now that's taken something that is totally usher and you've made the intimacy correct. When that happens, you'd start the wives of that relationship are dragged in somehow to this intimacy. Okay.
Well, I think you're mixing two things together. Meaning, 90% of what you said is correct. It doesn't, for Rashi, it's not as complicated. The last point that you made is unnecessary according to Rashi, but I do think it's necessary for the Ritva and the Ra'ah and the Ramban, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. Meaning, for Rashi, the point is that either there is Zika and therefore a mitzvah of Yibam, or not. As long as there's a mitzvah of Zika, right, then you have a heter of Eishes Ach. The second that there is a candidate, this is Rashi's take on the Maskana. The second that there is a candidate in the mix that is disqualified, that undermines the Zika. If there's no Zika, there's no mitzvah. If there's no mitzvah, then there's no heter, and everybody becomes an Eishes Ach. So the woman herself, the daughter, let's say what I calling the daughter of Shimon, I called her Shimona, right? She has two strikes against her. She's a daughter, and she's also an Eishes Ach. But all of the tsaros, there can be 100 of them, they're all Eishes Ach, because in the end of the day, Shimona ruined the mitzvah of Yibum, and when there's no mitzvah of Yibum, everybody's an Eishes Ach. That's Rashi. Now, what you just said in the end is a little bit going back to what I said last week, and that is the second perspective, which is there a way, so let me explain for one more minute. What's the problem with Rashi? Rashi holds this way, Tosas holds this way. Most of the Rishonim explain in one way or another, a little difference in formulation, that this Kiddush, this enormous Kiddush of Beis Hillel, which is that a Tsaras Erva is also excluded from Yibum, most of them agree that it works in this way, meaning it's misleading. It's not that Tsaras Erva is Ke'erva, that the association of, with an Erva rubs off and gives the Tsara, that legal status. That's not what's happening at all. Rather, the presence of an Erva, undermines Yibum, and once there's no Yibum, everybody becomes an Eishes Ach. So this woman has two strikes against her, and everybody else has one. But as long as you have one, that's it. It's kares, and certainly there's no Yibum. That's Rashi. However, there's a second perspective, and that second perspective is basically similar, to what I was saying before, except that you have to explain why it's only applicable to Yibum. Namely, the second perspective is that really the association, the connection between an erva and a tsara is what disqualifies the tsara. Meaning there's a legal category called tsaras erva. It's not that a tsaras erva, reverts to being an eishes ach shelo b'makom mitzvahs Yibum. It's that a tsaras erva has some of the dinim of an erva itself.
Was it Xeris HaKasav?
Yeah, well, it is based on Xeris HaKasav. We'll see the Xeris HaKasav in a minute on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. The Gemara said there are two actually. There's one suggestion on Gimel Amud Beis, and that's that in the Parsha and Echrimos, the Torah uses the expression litzror, and that is a reference to tsaros. The Gemara in Daf Ches Amud Aleph, in the name of Rabbi, quotes a different bakar: "V'lokach v'lokcha, v'yibam v'yibma." that's the source. But you need a limud for this because it's an enormous chiddush. So what is the chiddush, though? The chiddush is that when you are associated with an erva, that also excludes you from an intimate relationship. But then the question would be, and I'm going to show you who holds this way. How do I know people hold this way in just a second? It seems like Rashi was playing with this idea in Potros and Osros, but excluding it, right? But I'm going to show you that some Rishonim, at least some Shalkavataris of the Gemara, have to work with this idea. But then the question is, if there really is such a concept that the association with an erva also excludes one from marriage or intimacy, then how do you explain that why it's limited only to Yibum? Why doesn't it apply to a son-in-law, like we were saying before? Bob has a son-in-law, Bill, who is also married to another woman. Bill dies. Why can Bob marry the second wife?
Because there was no possibility for him to marry the first. And once you have, Yibum is the big surprise, not the rest. Once you have the ability to break the unthinkable.
No, but you can't, there's no possibility in that. In Bito, there's no possibility in that either. Because she's his daughter.
Yes. So therefore,
that's not the answer.
Problem. Once you break that unthinkable, like we do with Yibum. So Yibum is the one that we take for granted. Yibum is
right. But this
breaking the unthinkable. Once you do that, you create a potential error with those related to that unthinkable that you don't have to worry about so long as you never break it.
I don't think you need that. Again, for Rashi, you certainly don't need it. But what I'll tell you what I think it is. What I think it is very simple. It goes back to what you said about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And that is the whole idea of Tzaras Erva, even as an association, requires some sort of integration, some sort of connection, strong family connection between the two candidates or the two co-wives or the 100 co-wives. It doesn't make a difference. Meaning, when halachically, do we look at each of these women as an individual, as a separate entity, as opposed to, looking at them collectively, as the sorority or the wife, group of this person. So you could ask that question about Yibum, and you could ask that question about Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah, meaning if Bill had two wives, why do we have to look at his two wives together? He had a wife, Roberta, and he has another wife, Dinah, right? Why is Dinah defined by Roberta or associated with Roberta? Why is that true in Yibum, and why would that be true outside of Yibum? So I think the answer would be, according to that group, and that is that in Yibum, there's a Zika, and the Zika doesn't relate individually to each woman. The Zika relates to the bias. It's Asher Lo Yivna Beis Achiv. It's anyone, it's all, and it's anyone. It's not each one. And therefore, in Yibum, there are two things. Number one, in Yibum specifically, we look at the wives as a group, as a sorority. We don't look at them individually. But outside of Yibum, where there's a Zika, and where there is this common obligation that binds the group together, there's no legal reason for us to look at multiple wives in any other context as a group or as a unit. That's point number one. Point number two is the point that I think you are making. I just don't think you need it for Rashi. And that is, it could very well be, and I'm going to try to show this on Daf Ches Amud Beis, it could very well be that Yibum, even though on the one end you have the biggest kula, because there's the permissibility of an Eshesach, of the wife of a brother. On the other hand, that permissibility is something that you have to compensate for, lest you think that we are dropping all standards of sanctity when it comes to this particular marriage. So in one respect, we are being tremendously lenient, allowing Eshesach b'makom yibum for the sake of lahakim la'achiv shame. But in order to justify that, we're also hypersensitive to the appearance that this is not going to be a sanctified marriage. And therefore, dafka in the context of Yibum, aside from the question of Eshasach, which is what Yibum is, everything else is looked at under a magnifying glass. And therefore, the greater sensitivity, because you're allowing Eshasach, I think that's what you were saying. That's what I'm also saying. For this group, for the group that says it's not midin Eshas, that it doesn't revert to Eshasach. It's a din of Saras Erva. So that, I think, are the two perspectives. Now, how do we find...
That's Abba Shaul's viewpoint also, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's my view on Abba Shaul, 100%. That Abba Shaul, again, just to make it clear, I've mentioned in the past, but Abba Shaul has the following view, very remarkable view. Right? Abba Shaul says that when it comes to Yibum, you have to have the right intention as well. There's a lishma in Yibum, which we don't find in any other marital context. You need to have kavanah. You have to want to get married, but you don't have to want to get married for the right reasons. I mean, it's always good if you do, but you don't. It's not ma'akev. So when Abba Shaul on Daf Lamed Tes Lamed Beis, I'm just going to read it, even though we have it on Gimel Lamed Aleph, but we don't have the full, powerful formulation of it. If you turn just for a minute to Lamed Tes Lamed Beis, those of you who have Gemaras, which I think everybody does. So if you look towards the bottom of the page, you'll see the quotation of Abba Shaul. This is about 4/5 of the way down the page on Lamed Tes Lamed Beis. The last word on the line is Abba. Abba Shaul Omer. Everybody have that? In my Gemara, it's 3, 6, 9. It's like 11 lines up from the bottom of the page. The Gemara says, Abba Shaul Omer. Hakones Yivimto. If a person, is interested in completing, Yibum, in other words, in following through to do an act of Yibum, l'shem noi, but he's interested because he's pleased by the appearance, the attractiveness of the sister-in-law, right? L'shem ishus, or he thinks she'd be, a great wife, very industrious. She's very responsible. She has, good advice. She's unselfish. She has good meat, whatever it is. Ulashum davar acher, or some other motivation.
He did good due diligence.
Right. So listen to the language of Abba Shaul. This is very striking. Ki ilu pogea be'erva. It's as if, he's on the border of encountering erva. The karavani be'enai, says Abba Shaul, just interesting language, right? I'm close to thinking, right? Leos havlad mamzer, that a child that is produced from a yibum with the wrong motivation is going to be, or is close to being.
Wasn't it Abba Shaul? Well, Abba Shaul says to do chalitza because people don't have the right intention for yibum.
Yeah, so that's why on our daf on Gimel Lamed Aleph and on the top of the page here on Lamed Tes Lamed Beis and in Gemara and Ksuvas daf Samach Daled, Abba Shaul's practical point was, Abba Shaul said, listen, in the olden days when people really understood what it took to be to accomplish yibum, so yibum was preferable. But Bisman Azeh, says Abba Shaul, we don't trust that the people are going to have the right motivation, and therefore you're courting a religious or spiritual disaster, right? Because it's karav le'erva, karav lemamzer. And therefore Abba Shaul says, in my opinion, Bisman Azeh, chalitza is kodemes liyibum. Now we don't, the Bali Tosas, some of them paskin like Abba Shaul, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch does not paskin like Abba Shaul. But what you see from Abba Shaul is that on the one hand, you have this tremendous kula of heter eshes ach for the goal of lahakim la'achiv shem. But this noble goal, right, cannot justify. And on the contrary, for Abba Shaul, there's a hypersensitivity, to make sure, like, that everything else about this marriage or about this yibum, is kadasu kadin and is on the highest, of spiritual, motives as possible. So we'll discuss.
It's interesting that Abba Shaul's viewpoint is
Yeah.
basically that the mitzvah, even though the end result would have been what you needed, is to have this the Shah Hakim
Welcome, Shane.
you know. And if you notice by Yehuda and Aaron Onan, they weren't blamed because they reluctantly would have done it, in order to build up the brother's name. They were blamed because they weren't even willing to do it low
Yeah.
line.
Right.
If you look at
That's
the
true.
Torah, it doesn't seem to support Abba Shaul's viewpoint.
Well, so I don't want to do all of Abba Shaul right now, but the Nemuke Yosef is of the opinion that Abba Shaul is only a din d'Rabbanan. The Rambam clearly thinks that it's Daraisa. The Rambam has in Pirush Mishnayos and Bechoros and in the Tshuva.
I mean, it's clearly the optimal way one should act, but it
Yeah,
seems
yeah.
in Torah
Right.
that if you just at least did what you were supposed to do to make sure that there would be a name for your brother.
Yeah. Well, we've had, aside from Rabbeinu Tam, almost, most Rishonim Paskin like the Chachamim. But even in the Chachamim, there may be echoes of this concern for Abba Shaul, including what I'm trying to say now, which is that the tremendous kula of Heter Eshesach sometimes carries with it, by psychological, spiritual compensation, that you have to, ensure in other ways. You have to secure the sanctity of the seed.
Slippery slope, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but I don't only mean it a slippery slope, you'll make a mistake. What I mean is more conceptually, meaning you have to overcompensate because it's important that this be done in a sanctified, proper, way. So that's my theory on why it is two elements. Why even if there is a concept of tsaras erva, not eshesach, but by association, the stigma of being the co-wife of, still only in Yibum for two reasons. Number one, the zika is a mitzaref. The zika is what allows you to put all these people as a unit, to see them collectively rather than individually. And number two, the Yibum pressures you, right, to to secure a higher standard, one in which there's no shemetz of erva, there's no, even, hint of erva, and therefore maybe tsaras erva, even as a concept of tsaras erva, meaning it's not eshesach, it's tsaras spito, it's tsaras achos ishto. So how do we see this? So number one, I'll just give you a highlight in a couple of ways. The second idea, not Rashi, not Tosas, this idea that this tsaras erva is a category, but it's limited to Yibum. So first of all, the Meiri, there's mixed evidence in some of the Rishonim. I believe that many of the Rishonim felt that these were arguments in the Gemara, including Rashi that we just read, who basically was saying whether you say potros or whether you say osros, is dictated by whether there's a din of tsara erva outside of Yibum. Okay, so the Meiri on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph in Yevamos counts the arayos that are excluded from Yibum. So he counts the 15 of the Mishnah, understandably, and then he says, and there's another one that's called tsaras erva. Tsaras erva is also chayiv kares, he says, and it's also an erva that is excluded from Yibum. So the Mefarshim on the Meiri point out, number one, they point out contradictions in other places of the way he writes about it, but they just point out it's very strange, because if you held like Rashi, like Tosas, like what we were saying before, which is tsaras erva is not a category, tsaras erva is a circumstance which determines or dictates that there's no mitzvah of Yibum, and therefore Mimela there's an Isra of Eshesach. Eshesach is one of the arayos. Eshesach shalom b'makom Yibum. That's not a separate category called tsaras erva, right? So the Meiri on Daf Chav is obviously operating in a different way. I'll give you another example. The Gemara on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Let's look at the Gemara in Gimel Amud Beis for a minute. Either way, it's an important Gemara to read, and we'll fill in the blanks of what we're skipping till what we're going, well, hopefully next week. But let's look at the Gemara. And you asked before, is this Xeris HaKasuv? Is there a source? So let's talk about that also. So on Gimel Amud Beis, I also have it in the Mar Makomos. Those who don't have a Gemara, it's on the sheets as well. Look down, the last word on the 7th line from the top. The Gemara says, Minohanimili. So the Gemara says minani mili, which means what's the source? Now, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says that minani mili means three things or four things. Minani mili de erva, vitzarasa, vitzaras tsarasa, liolam pturos. Three things or four things. Rashi says the Gemara is searching for a source to teach you that an erva is excluded from ibam and chalitza. We'll get to that. And it's also looking for a source to teach you the din that tsaras erva is excluded, and also tsaras erva, and tsaras, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the makar. What is the makar? So the first one is for the erva, the Tan Rabbanan. A very interesting makar. Isha elachosa lo tikach litzror legalos ervasa aleha bechayaha. This is a pasuk in Parshas Achremos, in the Parsha of Arayos, right? It's part of what we read on Yom Kippur, by the way, at Mincha. So what does it say? It refers to Achos Ishto, the erva of a different kind of sister-in-law. I've made this comment already before. I don't think it's a complete coincidence, that the other sister-in-law, meaning Achos Ishto as opposed to Esha Sachiv, the sister of his wife as opposed to the wife of his brother, plays such a very prominent role in the Dinei Yibum. Because I think that they are both parallels and opposites, and I'll explain going forward. But either way,
Star is only limited to Bechayeha.
One second. So Isha Elach, because that's exactly, meaning there's a tremendous kula.
How do you use it for everybody else if it's only listed limited to Bechayeha, which is a great kula?
Yeah, no. So you could say kol shekain. It's funny the Gemara doesn't, because they're teaching you a chumrah. So if the chumrah applies to what otherwise is a kula, it should certainly apply to a chumrah. But to explain what you mean by that, in case everybody else doesn't know, achos ishto, the sister of a wife, is prohibited even after the husband and wife divorce, but it is permissible after the sister dies. I believe I mentioned it last week that Ariel Sharon, the general and former prime minister of Israel, he married his wife's sister. I think her name was Lily or something like that.
And it was fairly common 100 years ago. Because
am I right?
Many times one sister died in childbirth or something of that nature.
Yeah. So that is permissible.
The younger sister came in to both be mother and the wife to the.
Yeah. You can you can't marry two sisters at the same time. You can't marry two sisters even after a divorce, but you can marry a sister after the first sister dies, and that's what Sharon did. Anyways, as you say, many people used to do that. I don't know how many, but whatever. Anyways, so it's fascinating that that's not usually true of the cases in Achremos. They're usually prohibited forever, even after divorce and even after death. Okay. Anyway, this whole role of Achos Ishto, as I'll discuss as going forward, is really not fleshed out at all by the Rishonim, by the Achronim so much, but I think it's really a fascinating phenomenon. Anyways, Isha Lachosa, meaning if a person is married, he cannot have a relationship with his wife's sister. Lo tikach, you can't marry her, right? And then it says the word litzror, that's where the tsaras comes from. Legalo servasa aleha bechayah. Okay, as long as she is alive, because this would be a violation of her tznius, of her erva. So the Gemara says, aleha ma talmud lomar. Why do we need the word aleha? It could just have easily have been sufficient to write Isha lachosa lo tikach litzror legalo servasa. Her erva, what do you mean aleha? What's the aleha is extra. So the Gemara says an amazing thing, because they had this, very keen eye for the psukim. Ma Talmud lomar, lefi shenemar, the aleha is also the word that's used in the context of Yibum. Now, again, the parsha of Arayos is in Achremos, in Vayikra. The parsha of Yibum is in Kitetse. But there it says Yavamo, Yavo, aleha. That's also extra. You could just say Yavamo, Yavo, ba. What's the aleha? So the two alehos are put together. Shomeani, And so what it means is that even in the context of aleha, meaning yibum, there's still a prohibition of achos isha. That's the drasha. Shomei ani afilu ba'achas mikol arayos hu amuras b'torah kosav medaber. Right? Nemar kan aleha, the nemar lahalon aleha. But you might have thought that even if there is an impediment, another erva, bito, achosishto, chamiv, that still the urgency of lahakim lahakim shem b'Yisrael, well, just like it overrides Eshasach, maybe it should override the other one too. So it takes care of one. It'll take care of two or three or whatever. The answer is that's why the Torah says aleha, v'nemar lahalon aleha, to teach you ma lahalon b'makom mitzvah. Just as the word aleha refers to yibum in Dvarim, afkan b'makom mitzvah, so too here in Akremos, it's telling you cannot have a relationship with your wife's sister, even for the sake of the mitzvah of yibum. So that's how we know that at least achos isha. Then the Gemara is going to ask, well, maybe it should only be achos isha, but we'll get to that later. Oh, what about tzara? So the Gemara says, Amrach mana lotika. Fine. Then the Gemara says, Ainli Elahi. Maybe only she, meaning the Achos Isha or the Bito or the Chamim, they can't be a Yavama. But Sarasa Minayin, if there's a co-wife, why can't that co-wife be a Yavama? Beishama thinks it could, right? So this is the drasha, this is one of the drashas, another one on Daf Ches. Talmud Lomar Litzror. The word Litzror is a reference to tzara, meaning not only can a sister-in-law, meaning an achos ishto, not be a yibum candidate, also litzror aleha, her tzara is also excluded from yibum. So then the Gemara says, "Ainli ela tzarasa, tzarasa minayin." Let's say it's not a tzara serba, it's the tzara of a tzara. How do you get the tzara of a tzara, as we've discussed already? So, for example, let's say there's more than one brother. Let's say Reuven dies, and he leaves two wives. One of them is Shimona, the daughter, his niece, who he married, the daughter of Shimon. And the other is, Sarah, Sarah the tzara. Okay? So Shimon is out. He can't, there's no Yibum or Chalitza for Shimon for anybody, because that's Erva and Tzara Serva. But there's another brother, Levi. And Levi can marry his niece. And Levi, therefore, is not excluded from marrying Sarah, the co-wife of his niece. So let's say Levi is going to do Yibum on behalf of Reuven. He's not impeded like Shimon was. So he marries Sarah. And he also has another wife, let's say Rachel. Okay, so Levi, the second brother, or the third brother, however you want to call him, he does Yibum with Sarah from Reuven's first family, and he has his own wife called Sarah. I'm sorry, it's called Leah. Sorry. Okay. Now Nebuch, Levi dies as well. Also doesn't leave children. So meanwhile, we're back to Shimon again. Now Shimon faces two candidates for the Yibum of Levi. It's called Nefila Shnia. One is Sarah, who is also the co-wife of Shimona, his daughter, right? And the other one is Leah. Leah is nothing to him, except that she's the tzara of his tzara. She's the co-wife of his daughter, even though we're talking about different marriages now. Right? Sarah was a co-wife of his daughter with Reuven. And now Leah is a co-wife of the tzara of his daughter with Reuven, but with now Levi. So that's
the contact, no matter how far removed, it's a contact.
So that's called tzaras tzara. Okay. So the Gemara here says litzror, since it says litzror velo latzur, so that means tzaros harbe. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second and say the following. Do you need a separate source for a tzara erva and a tzaras tzara? or is it the same thing?
Is it a
So look at the Gemara for a
logic
moment.
question?
Say again?
It's a logic question. I mean, is it?
I'm asking logically. Yeah. Once you know tsaras, no, you need a source for tsaras erva. That's an enormous chiddush. We're working so hard to try to explain it. Again, it would have been easy just to say we paskin like Beis Shammai, but we don't. We're looking for truth. So we paskin like Beis Hillel, and we're trying to reconstruct and understand this enormous chiddush. And we have basically two approaches so far. But once you have a chiddush, once you know a pasuk that teaches you tsaras erva, do you need a second pasuk to teach you tsaras erva or tsaras erva?
The logic standpoint is that you would probably have to say, does it end? So it has to end somewhere. So you really need a pasuk to tell you it goes to Olam Vad, which is what the Gemara says.
So that's what I'm asking. Are you sure about
that's a big leap in faith. To say it goes on forever.
I would say the following. I would say it depends on the two perspectives that we've been discussing. Meaning, if the way tsaras erva works is it's not a big a chiddush as it looks. All it really means is that when you have a candidate for yibum that is not viable, it messes up the whole zika. That's all it really means. We're not saying tsaras erva is ke'erva. We're saying whenever there's an erva, there's no yibum because there's no zika. And if there's no yibum because there's no zika, then everybody ends up being eishasach, right? Once you say that chiddush, isn't that true for tsaras tsara the same way and tsaras tsara kol olam? It's the same thing. What happened here? Tsara was a tsara of Shimona, right? The first of Reuven. What does that mean? So why is Sarah excluded from Shimon from Yibum? Because she's an Eishasach, Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. Now Shimon encounters her when Nebuch Levi dies. She's still Eishasach, Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. So of course she should contaminate. That means there's no Yibum for the next group either. Everybody's Eishasach, Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. So once you know the chiddush of tsaras erva, you can make the case that you don't need any other makoros.
If we use.
However, one second. However, if we take the second view, which is no, that's not the way it works. Tsaras bito is tsaras bito, and tsaras achos ishto is tsaras achos ishto. Meaning, not only is an erva excluded, but when it comes to yibum, even the association with an erva is excluded. So just because you know that for tsaras erva means you know it for tsaras tsara. It's like a clone. It's like
because by tumah, for example, we know that it goes down levels and it gets weaker and weaker.
But what about something we talked about back in the day? Cherav areu kachalo, we say. We say that
that's exception.
There's an exception, but is a cherav kachalo metame a cherav kachalo? No,
but we have
even then when you deal with
that says
when you deal with formal
dinim.
Let me make it clear. When we say that Sarah, the Tsara of Shimona, if we're saying she's not Eishasach, what is she? She's Tsaras Bito, right? Do you have to give her a cake on your daughter's birthday?
Yeah, but
I'm only joking. But what I mean is, she's not his daughter, correct?
Right.
So how far are you going to go with it? You're going to say tsaras bito?
So typically, when we look at something that I would say is similar, tumah, for example, we see that you have a limit, and it varies by kachim.
Right.
By kachim is one thing, but it varies.
Right. So exactly. So what I would say, anything that is a law, that is a formal, not an actual, anything that is a clone or a virtual, the more you want to extend it, the more you have to prove it, because it always gets diluted, right? Sure. The only real erva here, see, the genius in Rashi is that everybody becomes achos, everybody comes directly an eishasach. They start off as a tsaras erva and they become an eishasach, but they're all full eishasach. There's nothing virtual. But according to the other view,
Each extension is going back to square one.
So that's fine. You don't need a pasuk for that. Once you know with the principle, you can just apply it across the
Well,
board.
it's not like Tuma where it gets weaker. Everyone goes back to the original strength.
Right, because those are virtual. They're not the real Tuma. But everybody's an Eish Ach. But not everybody's is everybody a Tzaras Abbas? He's a Tzaras Abbas. Or the Tzaras, if you know what I'm saying. So if you look at for 1 minute on the Gemara Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, just look at that for a minute. I'm going to stop in a few minutes, but give me a few more minutes because I couldn't get on earlier. Something wrong with my computer or my connection.
Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.
If you look at Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara seems to have two views on this matter. So look down 6 lines from the top. The first word on the line is Minohani Mili.
Yeah.
This is going on our Mishnah. The Mishnah says that Tsaros Erva is excluded. So the Gemara has another. It seems similar to Gemara and Gimel Amud Beis. I'll explain that in a minute. The Gemara says Minani Mili. How do you know this? That what? How do you know that? How do you know that Tsaras Erva or Tsaras Erva is excluded? So the Gemara says Amrav Yuna Markra Litzror. Same pasuk. HaTorah Ribsa Tsaros Harbe. The Torah includes multiple tsaros. It sounds like what we're saying is not only tsaras erva, but tsaras tsara, and maybe even more. But then the Gemara says, Ravashi Amar Svarahi. You don't need it. Once you know the din of tsaras erva, you don't need it more. It's logical. Tsara my time asira. Why is tsara excluded? Dibimakom erva kaima. Because the tsara, what? B'mokom erva, what does b'mokom erva mean? So if b'mokom erva means she's an Eish Ach, then that totally makes sense. Then tsaras tsara nami b'mokom erva kaima. The tsaras tsara is also an Eish Ach.
So what
As
does
long
the
as there's,
Tzur?
because once you've undermined the Zika in each case, everybody becomes an Eish Ach. So it's the same thing. You don't need an extra limud. It's not an added.
So what does he do with
law.
the word Tzur?
However, if you interpret that what's meant here is that there's a concept, a category called erva, and there's another category, like a virtual category called saras erva. Erva by association. There's guilt by association, there's erva by association, at least the Gabe Yibam. So then, is it really true that just because tsaras erva is b'makom erva, tsaras tsara is also b'makom erva?
Ravashi says yes, right?
Yeah, I mean the Gemara says it. So, but it could be that the Gemara is explaining, that according to the Rashi's view of Eshes, Shalom b'makom yiba.
Ravashi said this logic. We don't need a pasuk. We don't need.
If you look at exactly. If you look at, what about Gimel Amud Beis? So if you look on Gimel Amud Beis, what we just read, it's very interesting to note. Rashi says litzror tsaras harbe mashma b'dilok siv latzur, like Rabbi Yehuda on Yud Gimel. But if you look at the Gra on the Gemara, there's an os aleph. It says minayin tamalomer litzror. There's an aleph in brackets. So the Vilna Gaon on the side says the chen kasab is safe. He says you have to take it out. You see, put it in parentheses. The ein li'ela tsarasa tsaras tsarasa minayin tamalomer litzror v'lo latzur. So that was the girsa of Rashi.
So
Rabbi Tam,
you still would need Litzrar for the Tzaras Sir?
he says but the Gra is basically saying that once you have Tzaras Erva, you don't need any other psukim. So the Gra says that points out that Rabbeinu Tam, if you look in Tosar Rosh and the Ramban, they both quote Rabbeinu Tam approvingly, that this should not be, and this should be taken out of the text. Right? It says, "V'chein kaseh b'sefer Yashar Rabbeinu Tam b'chidush Ramban delo garsinan lo." You shouldn't have this extra few lines. V'zeh shekaseh Rashi lekamon Yud Gimel Amud Aleph mino animili detzaras tzarasa ptura umasha kaseh Rashi kan litzor tzaras harbe shinu Yud Rabbi Yehuda Nakat delo katosis le'el beis Amud Aleph. If you look carefully, maybe that's the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabashi, on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So if you look at Tosas, this is a discussion on Tosas on Beis Amud Aleph, and the Ramban disagrees with Tosas on Beis Amud Aleph too. If you look at Tosas, Divrei Maskil Ad Sof Ha'olam, the second Tosas on Beis Amud Aleph. So I'm not going to read the whole thing because it'll take too long. We have to stop in a minute. Just look a little bit. Go down in the Tosas, 3, 6, 8 lines down. The last word on the line, Vim Tomar. Tosas says Vim Tomar. Kivin the Tani Tsaros Tsarasein. Everybody have that?
Yeah, that's so for them.
Kivin the Tani Tsaros Tsarasein. Ad Sofa Olam Lamali. Similar problem. Once you know Tsaros Tsara, why do you need the Ad Sofa Olam? That's a little bit of a different question.
It's to say it goes on forever.
Yeah.
Well, so the question is harder to understand than I mean, it is a big chiddush to say it goes on forever.
But it can go on forever if it's all midin eshasach, because it doesn't really go on forever. It's just that each case ends up
all over again.
It just starts all over again. Each case knocks out the zika. Each case ends up being mimela, a case of eshasach. But if you think that it's a diluted or a virtual, erva, then every step, every step you take is a chiddush. You should at least need a pasuk to teach you that it keeps going. But Tosas here has again, I'm not going to read it inside, but if you look at the bottom now, go towards the end of the Tosas. He has 2 deos. He says, 1 second. If you look at the start of the middle lines, since Torah has 2 ratios, they thought you can only go 2, you can't go more. Meaning Torah, but not Torah, or Torah, etc. The Afilu Rabashi, the Nafkele Torah Misvara Lakaman Beperkid Gimel, the Pirkin Yodafid Gimel, the Komakom Itzrich Latana Lashmin and the Lotesa Gadait and the Member de Militzor Nafkan. So basically, Tosas is trying to work it out.
According to Tosas, Ravashi only holds 1 extension of straw.
Yeah, so that's the second day of Tosas. It says, no, Ravashi just means you need 2, but you don't need beyond 2.
So Ravashi has no logic to support beyond 2.
That's the second day of Tosas here. Yeah. Anyway, so what you can see is they're very interesting argument here about the relationship between Tsaras Erva and Tsaras Tzara and Tsaras Tzara at Sofa Olam. In my opinion, it reflects these 2 positions. But let me go a step further. I'm going to have to stop in a minute. The next Gemara, which I'm not going to read right now, but on Gimel Amud Beis, so we're going to read hopefully next time. The Gemara says, how do you know that Tsaras Erva is Bekares? Now, let's say he went ahead and he did Yibum with a Tsaras Erva. Now, let's say Shimon tried to do Yibum with his daughter's co-wife, Sarah. His daughter Shimona, right, has a co-wife, Sarah. That's her Sarah. And he's not supposed to, do Yibum or Chalitza with her. Let's say he did. What would be his punishment? So the Gemara isn't sure that he'd get kares. But if you hold like Rashi, and maybe that's the maskana, if every tsaras erva knocks out the yibum and becomes an eishes ach shelo b'makom yibum, then it has to be b'kares. Because that's the onesh, that's the punishment of eishes ach shelo b'makom yibum. It's kares. So how could there be a discussion in the Gemara whether that there is a tsaras erva, but it's not going to trigger kares? How could that be? And actually, Tosas on Ches Amud Beis thinks that on Ches Amud Beis there is a view that actually thinks it's only a violation of a mitzvah saseh, not more.
Violation of the mitzvah saseh, meaning a violation of yibum somehow?
Yeah, if you look here, look at on Ches Amud Beis for a minute. Look at the third Tosas. Tosas says, Kol heicha de'ika train likuchen. Everybody see that? The third Tosus on Ches Amud Beis.
Yeah.
Tosus, I'm just going to read a few lines. Bim tomar chayv yasei nami litzuri litzara. The leka lemember di boy hay nasiv boy hay nasiv. That forget about that. But otema, this is what I'm interested in. The hashta leka bitzaras erva kares. Bim kain ti boy chalitza kamo chayv yasei. Tosus thinks that according to this view in the Gemara on Ches Amud Beis, a tzaras erva cannot do yibum; it's prohibited, but it's not kares. It's not the onesh of kares. It's only a violation of a mitzvah saseh. Now, if you take the view that tzaras erva undermines the zika and every becomes eshasach, it has to be kares, right?
Yeah.
So what we see is that there are a lot of sources. I'm going to stop here because it's late, but what I want to pick up with next time, I want to show that the Ritva and the Ra'ah and the Ramban, go even further. That they think that Tzaras Erva is not Eshasach, Shalom B'Mokom Mitzvah. They think it's a category of Tzaras Erva. It's a kind of virtual associative Erva. Yeah. So we'll talk about that next time.
Is that
and then I want to
following the Rambam?
Well, the Rambam is tricky. We'll talk about the Rambam. The Rambam has a different limud for everything, but I also want to read. I want to show you the Gemara in Daf Ches. I want to finish up Tzaras Erva discussion next time, and then I want to move forward with the bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph, and then the parts on Gimel Amud Beis that we haven't yet done.
But is there a dichotomy here between Tosfos and the Sephardi, the Ramban and the Ritva and the?
You going back to Sephardi Ashkenazi problem?
No, because there's a
You didn't
Masorah.
let you do it last time.
Yeah.
And
No,
there's
I do think that there are different schools, and it doesn't always work out perfectly. But the idea that predominantly there's a certain impact and influence of certain figures is true in many topics.
The Ritva had both the Ramban and the Ra as his Rabbeim.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the line of impact, even greater than the Rajba. Rajba was a little bit more of a maverick because he had another Rebbe, Rabbeinu Yonah, and I think that influences things. But we'll see that in Mir Hashem next week, and we still have to talk about Hutra and Techuya. There are a lot of interesting topics, as you can see. This is a complicated. Some of these issues are complicated, but they're very
Intertwined.
They reward trying to understand them is very rewarding. They really point to a very profound perspective on these issues. Okay, so everybody should have a great week, and we'll continue with Hashem. Hopefully, I'll be back on my computer next week. I don't know what the problem is.
It's fine on your phone.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.